Hello and welcome. My name is Tom Scampion. I'm an MD at AlixPartners focusing on financial crime compliance, and I'm delighted to welcome so many of you here today for our discussion on cryptocurrency and the fight against financial crime. In the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to look at cryptocurrency growth and the risks that have come with this and what growth it's been. Over 8,000 cryptocurrencies now, market cap is well on the way to $2 trillion, equivalent to the GDP, I read, of Canada, the 9th largest country in the world. But of course, with that growth has come increased risk. FATF just last week published updated draft guidance on virtual assets covering a number of areas, including how to apply financial crime standards, refresh definitions for virtual assets and virtual asset service providers, the travel rule, of course, and related jurisdictional matters, and information sharing and cooperation between supervisors. Given the FATF guidance was only last published in June 2019, this is indeed a fast-moving area. So to discuss this, we're going to have a conversation in three parts. The first will be an overview of cryptocurrencies and related financial crime risks. Then we'll look at regulation and enforcement. And then finally, we'll have a discussion on investigations and how institutions can best protect themselves. A piece of administration, please add your questions to the chat function. And if we've got time, we'll absolutely cover them today. If we haven't, we will email responses after the session. I'm delighted to have a great panel, as you can see in front of you, for the discussion today. So let's meet them. Let's go in order, and I see James Ramsden, please. James.
Well, good afternoon. It's an absolute pleasure to be taking part in this webinar. I am Queen's Counsel from Astraea Group. I had the dubious privilege, which turned out to be quite a pleasure, of obtaining the first UK freezing and disclosure order in relation to crypto assets way back in September 2018. And since then, I visited the Cayman Islands, BVI, Singapore, and various other points, east and west, doing the same thing. And I hope to share a little bit of that experience with you a little later.
Super. Can I now hand over to Nina Stewart? Welcome.
Good afternoon, my name's Nina Stewart. I work with James at Astraea Group, but rather than being a lawyer by background, I'm a chartered accountant and chartered tax advisor.
Super. And who do I see next? Mark, I see you, Mark Doughty.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Doughty. I'm a consultant here at AlixPartners. I'm a data specialist. I primarily work in investigations and disputes matters. Usually where there are large data volumes or complex data structures that need to be understood and analysed. We've seen an increasing number of matters involving cryptos recently. So as a technologist on these cases, my job would be to really get under the hood and understand the mechanics of the underlying blockchains. Thanks, Tom.
Super, thank you, Mark. And David White, and thank you for getting up particularly early this morning, David, most appreciated.
Thank you, Tom. It's only 7 a.m. here in Los Angeles, sunny Los Angeles. My name's David White. I'm one of the co-chairs of our global data privacy and security practice groups. My practice focuses heavily on digital investigations and computer forensics. I'm a certified cryptocurrency forensic investigator and former litigator, and lead most of the investigations at our firm into cryptocurrencies.
Fabulous. So thank you, panel. Let's get into the first part of our discussion, if we may. And I'm going to address this to Mark. Mark, can you give us an overview of cryptocurrencies and the sorts of financial crime risks that they bring? Mark.
Yeah, sure, Tom. So the best place to start is probably with the most well-known cryptocurrency, which is obviously Bitcoin. It's recently got increased institutional investment and retail adoption, which has really been driving the price up, and this is what it's been in the news for, particularly recently. But as well as Bitcoin, there's also many other different cryptocurrencies, lots of different flavors. Some of them are more geared towards security and privacy. Some of them have a higher throughput, so more transactions. And some of them are programmable and have what we call smart contracts, which sit on the top of them. I think what I'd like to go through is the 4 kind of key aspects that generally apply to cryptos. And I appreciate that not all of them conform to these, but most of them do to a more or lesser extent. So the first point I want to cover is ownership and transfer. So all cryptocurrencies are recording ownership of a digital asset or a value, and are providing a mechanism for that ownership to be transferred. The second point is they are distributed and decentralized. So all transactions are on a distributed ledger, which everyone can access. And the best way to think of this in kind of a traditional accounting sense is that if I have a ledger, everybody else within my cryptocurrency network also has the same ledger. So Tom, if I write a payment from me to you in my ledger, then everybody else within my cryptocurrency network also writes that same transaction on their network as well, sorry, on their ledger as well. So in this cryptocurrency network, there's no central bank, and it's not controlled by a central company or anything like that, a central country. So we rely on consensus between different people in the network to validate transactions, ultimately to provide us with trust that if Tom's going to pay me, that he can, and that he does. So the big advantage to this distributed and decentralized setup is there's fast settlement and there's a reduction in cost, because you don't have banks in the middle transferring and settling your funds for you. It's direct. Also, they're not easily manipulated, because there's not a government or a central party that's owning the currency and controlling the currency. And the other point is that it also makes financial services available to everybody. So if you don't have the credentials to get a bank account, you don't need one in a cryptocurrency environment. Just with a computer or a phone, you can access cryptocurrencies straight away. So the downside, obviously, of this is that without these central parties and these banks, who do you go to if your money goes missing? Because it is a decentralized network. The next aspect, so number 3, is cryptography. And this is how you control and prove ownership of your money or your cryptocurrency without a bank. Now, I won't go into the intricacies of the details of this, but it's done through public-private keys. And I find the best way to think about this is think of your bank account as being your public address or your public key, and it's just a digital code that just sits out there on the ledger and basically just has money recorded against it. And then your private key is almost like your password or your PIN number that you can use to control the money that's against that public address. And in the cryptocurrency space, there's a common saying, not your key, not your coin. And what that refers to is, if I lose my private key, I can't control the funds against my public address anymore. So we've probably all heard about a landfill site in Wales that's got Bitcoin in it somewhere that are now lost. Essentially, that is a hard drive of these private keys that without them, we can't unlock the Bitcoin that's associated against these public addresses. Or in the press as well, we hear a lot about hacks on cryptocurrencies. And that's to do with when someone steals your private key and then gets control of your funds. I think one of the biggest ones was the Mt. Gox hack, which ultimately led to it going bankrupt. The final point I want to cover is the pseudo-anonymity of cryptocurrencies. So when you look at this public ledger, you can see the transactions and the payments between these different public addresses or these accounts that I was talking about. But what you can't see is who that account relates to. You just see a public address. So if you look on the public ledger, you won't see Mark Doughty stored anywhere. You will just see a digital code, and you won't be able to associate that easily with me. And this is what makes cryptocurrencies ideal for illicit activity. So things like darknet markets, ransomware, or indeed scams. A couple of big Ponzi schemes that you may or may not have heard of, BitConnect and Plus Token, or even actually the Twitter Bitcoin scam. They're all promises of a high yield based on investing in cryptocurrencies that never comes to fruition. Particularly a few years ago, ICOs are very popular. So people buying tokens within companies an ICO's initial coin offering. So it's a way of raising money, and investors would buy tokens that what they were actually buying maybe didn't exist yet or didn't have any value. So where this leaves us from a regulatory perspective is this changing environment of all these different characteristics, and a regulator trying to balance integrity, stability, and protect the consumer against innovation. And it's a tough job.
Mark, thank you very much. James, I'm going to come to you if I may. Mark referred to these conditions being ideal for illicit activity, and I noticed last week the Financial Times had a headline saying that the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK was bracing itself for an explosion of scams in the virtual world. Is there good news?
Yeah, there is good news. The regular crypto blogger, Mark Ginsburg, said blockchain is the technology. Bitcoin is merely the first mainstream manifestation of its potential. And I think that's right. You have to separate the two things. Blockchain technology is going to be a very important part of our future. Whether it's used in smart contracts or in other kinds of transactions, it gives you a traceable and indelible record. But Mark was quite right in saying that it is available to those who may not be able to get into the mainstream banking industry. Now, whilst that might invite the party a number of unsavory and unwanted guests, it actually enables a lot of people who deserve to be enabled. And I see it in its digital currency manifestation as a disruptor of the financial establishment. And although it might be a conventional or a controversial view rather, I happen to think that's a good thing in the long term. So yeah, there is some good news, but there are some huge pitfalls to watch out for along the way.
And so let's pick up on that pitfall point, and maybe David, I can come to you. It sounds like this is going to be tough to regulate. And if there are these pitfalls, how do we get our heads around regulating this?
It is difficult to regulate, mostly because it's new technology, and as we know, regulations are always, a few years behind technology. So the regulators are very much just catching up to understanding what's going on and how to get their arms around it. But there are many intrinsic reasons why the regulators are struggling with cryptocurrencies as well. Most of the attributes that Mark just described, while pluses in the ecosystem and allow better access to financial instruments and have all the values that he described, also have a lot of negatives that go along with them. For example, we discussed decentralization and the removal of centralized institutions from the ecosystem. That's a wonderful thing and allows for freer movement of value. However, it also prevents the regulators from going to a centralized institution and leveraging their power to gain control over assets. So in traditional banking, if somebody's committing fraud with a banking account, it's quite easy to contact that bank, figure out who those people are, and lock those assets and make an attempt to recover them. As James described, doing that with cryptocurrency has been extremely difficult and with very limited success because there's no central authority to go to. Another aspect is the virtualization of currencies. Where are cryptocurrencies? They don't really exist anywhere in time and space. We use all these constructs. We talk about transfers and exchanges, but none of those things actually occur. We do have digital ledgers, as Mark described, and those ledgers sort of just exist everywhere on the network, and nothing is ever really transferred. When I quote unquote send you 5 Bitcoin, I'm not actually sending anything to anybody. I'm simply marking on the ledger that I agree that value that I used to hold, now I'm transferring to you so that you can leverage and respend that value, but nothing ever moves other than some bits and bytes on the internet. So that makes it very difficult because there's jurisdictional questions that come up because of that. You just don't know who to regulate and how to get control of things because there's no actual physical thing existing in any space and time. The last issue is really no clear definition of what cryptocurrency are. There's, as Tom, you mentioned, there's so many different varieties out there today. And regulators have really struggled with defining what they actually are. In some instances, we see them as commodities to be bought and sold and traded on exchanges. And the regulators have treated them as such in that regard and regulated them like any other commodity. In other instances, they've seen them as investment vehicles where, you know, a group of investors come together to pool their funds for some hopeful gain down the road. And that's usually with, as Mark mentioned, ICOs, where oftentimes, you know, what folks are investing into turns out to be a scam or an exit scam, or there's really no value there, and the investors were duped. In other instances, the regulators have treated them like property, particularly in the taxation space, and treated them in ways that are different. And all of these things have serious implications for how, you know, our traditional laws and regulations apply in the classification. But across all jurisdictions around the globe, there's really no agreement on any of those issues.
Well, let's use that. Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone. Let me use that as a segue into the second of our three sections and talk about regulation. And maybe, Nina, I can ask you this question first, if I may, which is really, you know, what are the features of good and bad regulation in this very difficult to regulate space?
Sure. I mean, the first thing to say is that, as David mentioned, regulation worldwide varies enormously. And one of the big challenges, as he said, is how do you define a crypto asset? So if we look first of all at sort of how do you define what sort of good regulation is, a good regulation really requires a very clear definition of what a crypto asset is, and then very clear guidance around how crypto assets interact with other financial services legislation. So if we look at the EU first as an example of a good, good legislation, a good regime, a regulation around crypto. The EU initially used the term virtual currency, but more recently have started using the term crypto asset as an umbrella term, which I think is more appropriate. The EU has a very, very well developed framework. There's very clear definition of what a crypto asset is and guidance around the interaction with existing financial services regulations, such as the AML legislation and MiFID, etc. Although the EU legislation is already very good and that regulation is very good, the EU Commission last September published a proposal to further strengthen it, and they published a report called Markets in Crypto Regulation, with the aim really to make the EU the global standard for crypto regulation, which should enable it to attract crypto talent and platforms to the region. So some critics, although that sounds like a good thing, some critics are concerned that it may overshoot the mark and impose insurmountable constraints on businesses. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this develops. James, perhaps as an example of good regulation avoiding overreach, you could tell us a bit about the Singapore regime and then talk about some other jurisdictions where the regulations are a bit less effective.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. This really ties in with what David was talking about. The big problem with regulation is the lack of consistency in the definition of what is a crypto asset. So I'm going to stick my neck out and give you my favorite, which was devised in the UAE, and it has been picked up by and used by a number of the better regulated jurisdictions. And it is simply this: a crypto asset is a digital representation of value that can be traded and functions in one of three ways: either a medium of exchange, a unit of account, or a store of value. It's neither issued nor guaranteed by any jurisdiction, and it fulfills these functions only by agreement within the community of users. Now, that last part of the definition is really the key to crypto assets. Now, that definition has been polished a little bit, particularly in the UK and other common law jurisdictions, which have decided that crypto assets are to be treated as property, not as currency. Now, that has a real significance when we come on to look at financial crime and enforcement. So how does that all translate? Well, I would say the best regulated jurisdiction, and the one that is reaping the benefits of that, because a lot of crypto trading platforms want to go there and trade there, is, perhaps unsurprisingly, Singapore. And what Singapore has done has recognized through the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the MAS, and the Securities and Futures Act, that it must regard crypto in two entirely distinct ways. First of all, it is property and to be treated as property and something that can be traded like a commodity. But equally, and there's no getting away from this, it is used as a sort of proto-currency. So it's used for payment. So in Singapore, there is an entirely separate treatment of crypto. Firstly, under the Securities and Futures Act in relation to its mining, its origination, its issue, and its trading. And secondly, and quite separately, there are a whole realm of payment service regulations which address the question and use of crypto for payment services. And so far, that regulation works very well. Do we have a contrast? Well, it's hardly a regulatory revelation to say that two well-known low-tax offshore jurisdictions don't exactly gold plate their regulation. They are Malta and Gibraltar. Malta has tried a one-size-fits-all piece of legislation called the Virtual Financial Assets Act. And to get VFA authorization, as it is known, is remarkably easy. I could probably do it this afternoon. And if I get that authorization, I can do anything from originating or mining crypto to using it for payment services to setting up a dealing platform. A very similar position in Gibraltar, which is particularly important given that jurisdiction's prominence in the offshore online gaming industry. The Gibraltar Financial Services Commission has drawn up a regulatory framework which really makes no distinction at all between crypto issuers and crypto dealers, nor crucially between custodian services and non-custodian services. Mark touched earlier on the question of storing crypto and the way you do that. One of the biggest regulatory challenges in all the jurisdictions, and increasingly in the UK, is the use of cold wallets to store crypto entirely offline and anonymously, in circumstances where a cold wallet can be constituted either by a physical data stick or in most cases simply a digital code. That can be given to a solicitor or accountant. They can be asked to hang on to it for safekeeping, not knowing that they are sitting on millions and millions of dollars or sterling worth of assets and value in circumstances where they would never dream of doing that with their client account. So big regulatory issues there. That brings me to the US, and I'm going to defer to David, whose expertise there far outweighs mine. But I find the US fascinating for two reasons. Firstly, there's a huge arm wrestle at the moment between whether crypto is to be regarded as a security or a commodity. And there is a real friction between state regulation. In some states, it's very advanced and very sophisticated, and federal regulation. And you've got overlaying that FinCEN, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the SEC, and OFAC, all of which I have to say I have a very high regard for as regulators, but all looking at crypto from a slightly different perspective. So David is going to explain all of that far better than I could attempt. So over to you, David.
It's a bit of a mishmash of alphabet soup with all of the federal regulator acronyms that are involved in this mix. And again, that's because of the definition of cryptocurrencies is really all over the place, and the characteristics of cryptocurrencies, as was just pointed out, is all over the place. So we do have a number of federal agencies that are all sort of got their toes in the pond, so to speak. The SEC, which is our Securities and Exchange Commission, is mostly concerned with the transactions of securities. And whenever they can classify a cryptocurrency as a security or an investment vehicle, they certainly have been involved. And again, that's mostly been around ICOs and other types of sort of investment type activities for different offerings. Because cryptocurrencies are decentralized and just because of all the characteristics that we talked about earlier, the regulators have been unable to regulate the digital currencies themselves in most instances. Those that have tried have generally failed massively. So what they have had success in doing and where they have focused their energy is regulating around the periphery of them. So regulating the exchange mechanisms of how people convert cryptocurrencies from one currency to another or into fiat currency, or regular state-backed monetary actual money, or regulating the purchase and sale activities around them, or regulating the investment activities around ICOs. And it's in those areas that we see most of these regulators getting involved. And as James mentioned, one of the biggest struggle again has been this classification of is cryptocurrency a security or is it an investment vehicle? And a lot of the sort of actions that have come out of this have tried to hone in on that and define it much more clearly. We also see the IRS getting involved on taxation issues, where they've been trying to make sure they're getting their fair share or unfair share of taxes, depending on what side of that dispute you sit on. But cryptocurrencies have proved very, very difficult to tax because, again, everything is virtual and it's hard to know which jurisdiction they're sitting in and how to tax them properly. And then we also see, again, the states, much like different countries having favorable laws and some not having favorable laws, we see the states across the United States doing that. Oddly enough, Wyoming is our Singapore of the United States, where they're the most favorable state right now in the United States. And they've set up a lot of different laws that have tried to attract cryptocurrency enterprises to function there and make the state sort of the cryptocurrency capital of our country. Whereas New York, which is typically our financial center, out of the gate was very, very strict in the beginning and tried to really control it as much as possible. Now they're backtracking on that quite a bit and saying, oh, maybe that was a mistake and we're pushing all the cryptocurrency away. It's probably here to stay, so let's try to work with it. And most recently, they've been looking at making broker dealers the primary vehicle, registered broker dealers the primary vehicles for running exchanges in New York.
David, can I just dive in with a quick question? How do you think the new Biden administration is going to change policy, if at all? I mean, our previous governor of the Bank of England was notoriously indifferent towards crypto assets, thought it would all disappear fairly shortly, and it was difficult to work out what the Trump administration thought. What about this administration?
The Biden administration has been pretty aggressive on bringing regulations back, and they've made it their mandate to sort of beef up the regulatory commissions quite a bit. Biden has appointed new heads of the SEC, the CFTC, and the OCC, and I think they're looking at it a bit more aggressively, but I also think they're looking at it a lot more intelligently, with an eye towards working out the problems as opposed to just getting in there and being the tough cops that they're often known to be. So I think we're going to see a lot of changes, but I think they're going to be positive changes in a way that makes the ecosystem more functional and less risky for folks.
Let me jump in. I'm going to just I've looked at some of the questions that are coming in, and I might just throw them out to people because I think if we can answer them as we go along, they're probably in context now and they may not be later. Somebody's asked the question, what are the key implications of treating a crypto asset as property rather than currency? Who would like to take that question?
I'm happy to have a stab at that because it has a very important and immediate legal consequence. If you have cash in your bank, that's not your property. All you have is a right to sue the bank for that value. So when you lose cash, all you've got is a claim in damages. So if somebody steals your money, that's all you've got. If someone steals your property, that's your property and it remains your property. And the key to that is that you can trace that property into the hands of the thief. And you can do more than that, because if the thief has changed your property into other property because he sold it or he's mingled it with his own or he's used it to build an asset which has real value, you can trace into that asset. You are deemed to own however much of that asset as represents your property. And as we'll see in due course, when it comes to freezing injunctions, for example, in fraud enforcement actions, if you get a freezing injunction over crypto assets on the basis that it's your property, then the defendant can't spend any of that to defend himself against your claim. He's got to go and find his legal fees somewhere else. Now that's of acute interest to lawyers on both sides of the fence in such circumstances. So it has real importance. I think not classifying it as a currency takes it away from central banks and the whole issue of denominating it. Sooner or later someone might denominate it and it becomes a currency. I think as long as it's property, that can't happen.
Yeah, another key area is damages, right? Calculations. The difference being, if I invest in an enterprise, the value of my investment at the time of investment might be recoverable, or the value of the asset at the time of recovery might be it. And we saw with Mt. Gox in the bankruptcy proceedings, this issue was central to that, because should the folks who put money into the Mt. Gox exchange get back the value that they put in, or the value of the Bitcoins at the time of settlement, which, with the massive variations in valuation, can be extremely different. In that case, it was hundreds of dollars versus tens of thousands of dollars of recovery. And if the victims aren't allowed to recover that difference, who gets the windfall?
Right. I'm going to ask one more question. I know that some questions are coming in. I promise we will answer them all in due course. Mark, can I ask you this quick question? I think we almost covered it at the beginning, but somebody's asked, I've heard of people losing Bitcoin because they physically lost the CD-ROM, the Cardiff waste disposal example, but that seems redundant with the distributed ledger. Can you just explain that again, or explain it so we're all on the same page?
Yeah, sure, no problem. So the example of the lost hard drive, or in this case, the CD-ROM being lost, that is effectively where you store your private key. So imagine a digital code, it's numbers and characters, it's, I don't know, 40 characters long, however long it is. That's your private key that unlocks your bank account. It's your password, if you like to think of it that way. If you lose that, on the distributed ledger that everyone can see, you have your account number or your public address. And without your private key, you can't do anything with the funds that are stored against that address. So if you lose it, for example, or your CD-ROM has gone and no one's got that private key anymore, the money, or if we're talking about Bitcoin, that sits against that public address is effectively lost. It's just stuck there. So on the ledger, it'll say this address has got this much Bitcoin against it, but no one will ever be able to spend it without those private keys.
Thank you, Mark. Mark, can you stay in the spotlight for a moment? Because I think I might ask you about UK examples of regulation. Maybe just a short couple of comments on that before we keep moving along.
Yeah, sure. So in the UK, we have a national regulator rather than the federated structure in the US, and it's the FCA who oversee financial markets in the UK. Back in 2018, the UK set up a crypto asset task force, which was to provide a view across the Bank of England, the Treasury and the FCA as to how to regulate crypto assets. In terms of the classifications, which I know we've spoken quite a lot about, the FCA have come up with three main groups. So it's e-money, security coins, and then unregulated coins. And back to what Nina was saying previously about retrofitting existing legislation, if your cryptocurrency falls into e-money, there's existing e-money legislation that applies. If it's a security coin, so these tend to be tokenized assets, then we've got existing security regulation that applies to those. And then the final bucket, the unregulated piece, are utility and exchange tokens. And this is basically everything that doesn't fall into the above two. And this is where Bitcoin and Ether would sit. And this is outside of the FCA's regulatory perimeter. And what that means is that you don't get the same protections if you're investing in those as you would from a regulated product. So this might be, you might not have access to the FOS, Financial Ombudsman, or the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. And the FCA make it clear that consumers should be made aware that they don't get this protection when investing in these unregulated coins. With regards to money laundering regulation, if you are a business that operates with crypto assets in the UK, and even the unregulated category that I just spoke about, then you do have to now be registered with the FCA, and you have to comply with the money laundering regulations. And part of this is the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive, which was originally issued by the EU, but has now been transposed by the UK, and is in effect in the UK. And the language in that expands the scope to now include crypto exchanges and wallet providers. So they will now have to do KYC procedures and have policies in place and reporting you would have to do as part of those regulations. Two, I guess, latest developments from the UK would be the start of this year. The FCA banned trading on Bitcoin derivatives to retail users due to inherent risks I've already spoken about. And also there's just been a consultation by the FCA on stable coins. What these are cryptocurrencies that are pegged to either the value of another cryptocurrency or a fiat currency. And potentially these might form another category of cryptocurrency.
Mark, thank you very much. I'm going to keep us moving along, and I'm going to go on to Nina now, if I may, and talk about, and we've kind of, I guess, touched on some of them, but some of the regulatory challenges that we are likely to be subject to, and then maybe we can look at some enforcement examples after that. So, Nina.
Sure. I think I'm going to let James talk about some of the recent enforcement actions and cases, but before he goes on to do that, we'll talk a little bit about some of the regulatory challenges facing both crypto platforms and also professional services firms, so accountants, lawyers, etc. James has mentioned it already, but the increasing use of cold wallets causes a lot of regulatory challenges for accountants, law firms, etc. So as you mentioned, if a client gives you a hard drive, is that akin to somebody asking to hold money in your client account? Yes, it is, and you need to be very aware of that as a professional services firm. And actually the SRA and ICAW are looking into this at the moment to work out sort of what regulation needs to be put in place to address this increasing use of cold wallets. So I think that's a big issue to be aware of on the professional services side. If we turn to crypto platforms themselves, they've traditionally had quite poor due diligence and KYC processes in place, which has meant they're increasingly open to cyber attacks and hackers, as well as attracting money laundering activity. So it's been relatively easy for criminals and to purchase crypto assets and then to store them in cold wallets so they can't really be detected. So that really causes some challenges, which James can come on to talk about when trying to enforce in legal cases, because actually the nature of cold wallets is you can't see them, you don't know they're there, they're only really open to whoever has the cold wallet encryption code. So that causes a lot of challenges when you're trying to enforce legal action. We're also increasingly seeing this in matrimonial cases as well. I noticed there's a question actually on the chat about this. So we're increasingly seeing, one spouse trying to hide cash, purchasing crypto, putting it in a cold wallet. It can't be seen anymore. So it's causing a lot of challenges on the regulatory side, and also then on the enforcement, which James can come on and give some specific examples of.
Yeah, well, I'm going to give you a quick trilogy of cases spanning 3 years, which really cover, to me, the most important developments in relation to enforcement action concerning crypto assets, always arising, sadly, out of some kind of fraudulent activity. The first was the one I mentioned in passing in my bio, which was, so far as we're aware, the first UK freezing and search order in relation to crypto assets. And it concerned a defendant called Nebius, otherwise known by its trading name as Money for You. And it was an extraordinary outfit. It was a crowdfunded operation initially, had a correspondence address in Canary Wharf. You ring up, look on the website, think you were dealing with Citibank. Sadly, you weren't. They ran actually a very good concept. It was a concept whereby you lodged crypto with them, and they would issue to you a MasterCard payment card, and you could just go out onto the high street and spend it. They would, however, leverage your crypto whilst they held it as collateral for the money on your MasterCard. And whilst they were making money, that all worked swimmingly. But as soon as they started to lose it, we all know the volatility of the market, things went wrong. And they lost a lot of our clients' money. So we went off to court, and did so after some extremely clever techies put us in a very good position by developing some software which essentially allowed us to trace the use of both publicly accessible wallet codes and the private codes that Mark was referring to earlier. And what that told us very early on, going back to our observations about blockchain technology, is that once you've cracked the sort of evidential door, the portcullis, then blockchain technology is a fantastic thing, because most fraudsters will go to great lengths to cover their tracks. But with blockchain technology, you can't do that, because once you've identified the wrongdoer's wallet, there is an indelible record of what they've done in terms of trades in that wallet and through that wallet, and where the crypto that has passed through it has gone subsequently. And that proved to be extremely helpful indeed. We got a freezing order, we got a worldwide freezing order, we got disclosure orders, which were responded to surprisingly well and constructively by various regulators, including in the US. Crucially, right at the beginning of the story, the judge decided that he would rather regard crypto in that case as property, not currency, and that has become the consistent view of judges. And indeed, the task force that Mark was referring to earlier, part of their report was to say that that was also their view. Second case, much more recent, June last year, was in the Cayman Islands, and this involved a very significant and sophisticated hack of the largest crypto trading platform by volume in the world. It is ultimately domiciled in the Cayman Islands, and hence we went there to bring our claim. And that was significant for this reason. As is always the case in crypto enforcement claims, you very rarely know the identity of the person who is the wallet holder or the holder of the electronic key to the crypto that's been dealt with. And that's very often because due diligence and KYC on the part of platforms is poor. Sometimes it may not be poor, but that's all that is visible to you on a forensic search of the transactions. We managed to convert law, which has previously been used in internet takedown actions, whereby we got orders to freeze assets and for disclosure against persons unknown. Now, though that might sound bizarre and unworkable, it actually worked really well. So just as you may have an anonymous blog or post on the internet, you can get an order that whoever's done that, take it down, even though you can't name them. We did the same thing with crypto by reference to wallet keys, which identify those individuals. And what that allowed us to do, that opened the door to whatever KYC the platforms they were dealing on had got on them. And we managed to reverse engineer their identities from the obtaining of the orders in the Cayman Islands in 4 different jurisdictions, and it worked extremely well. I'm not able to say how much was taken, but it was a considerable sum, and the client recovered about 75% of that within 3 months. It was a highly effective weapon. But the key to that is really the adaptation of what are, in many cases, quite well-established legal devices and tools to what is very, very unusual and new and evolving technology. What was interesting about that hack, and it was a technically sophisticated hack, was actually carried out by 6 guys in Cairo on their smartphones. And they stole many tens of millions of dollars, 25% of which my client didn't get back. So that just shows the exposure there is out there. Third example, very briefly, even more recent, 20th of December last year, the Iron Sciences case, which was also very important, because particularly important in the UK, because it decided that, contrary to what we'd all thought previously, an English court can make a disclosure order against a foreign entity which is enforceable in that jurisdiction. So in our Nebius case, we had to go to New York with our English order and ask a New York court to enforce it, which in fairness it did. But now there is the ability to seek to enforce without going through those hoops. And the reality is that once you have one of those orders and various counterparties, like banks, correspondent banks, and other counterparties get to know about them, the fraudsters retreat pretty quickly. And it's certainly my experience of the first of those 2 cases in which I was directly involved and led the team, that the most effective way to reveal the fraudster is when inevitably, and it nearly always happens, the fraudster has to convert their crypto assets back into fiat or into other tangible assets. And that gives you the opportunity. That's where the torch can shine its light on what's happened, and you can reverse engineer back into the blockchain technology. And as I said a moment ago, once you've got that lead, once you've got your teeth into that part of the technology, there's nothing the fraudster can do. He or she has left an indelible train of transactions you can trace. So little bit of a breathless trilogy, but 3 good examples of recent enforcement.
Excellent, James. Very helpful. Thank you for that. Let's now move to the third of our 3 parts of our conversation. So we've covered the introduction of cryptocurrencies and financial crime risks. We've looked at regulation and enforcement with those examples now from James, which is great. Now the third part. Let's look at investigations and how you can protect yourself. And hopefully we'll pick up some of the questions in the Q&A as we do so. David, let's start with you. Investigations. I probably think I know some of the answer, but why are they tough?
Why are they tough? They're tough because of the anonymization factor of cryptocurrencies, right? As James just described, it's difficult to know who the actors themselves are. We can see the transactions on the ledger, but it's often difficult to see who is participating in those transactions. And it's difficult to see where those transactions are coming from and going to. We've been able to use a lot of tools and develop a lot of tools ourselves in-house that use data analytics and machine learning and apply different heuristics to the transactions on the ledger to look at spending patterns and to look at key functions of how cryptocurrencies work, such as the use of change addresses, whereby with Bitcoin you can only spend in whatever increments you hold. If I hold a full Bitcoin and I want to give you a half a Bitcoin, I can't, just like a $10 bill, I can't spend half a $10 bill. I have to give you the $10 bill and get $5 change back. And that's similar in how Bitcoin works as well. So looking at those change addresses and where transactions are going, we're able to cluster transactions around what we refer to as entities. And then we're able to use a lot of public information and other information to de-identify those entities, particularly at the periphery, again, particularly at the points of ingress and egress. But we're also, there's a lot of known information out there, a lot of intelligence out there that lets us know, if certain actors have been engaged in using the dark net or using, involved in criminal activities or related to ransomware, or are using illicit markets, or using high-risk exchanges known to have very bad KYC policies. So we can identify sort of the risk level of those actors as well, and to know whether we should be participating in transactions with them or not, or using that to help trace and track them as well. So most of the ways that we're able to do that is by tracing transactions to the point of ingress or egress, and then going to those exchanges and having, issuing a subpoena so that we can identify who those actors are in that instance. But again, the issue with cold wallets is a very real and difficult one, because there's different ways to store your value. You can either give it to a custodian, such as a Binance or Coinbase or other well-known exchange, where they're actually taking possession of your assets and managing them for you. And that's when we're able to subpoena them and find out who they're holding assets on behalf of. You can also have them in a hot wallet, which is an online wallet that you're using, which you're the custodian of those assets. And those are more difficult to track because we don't really know who's controlling the hot wallet, but we can see the movement a lot easier. The third option is to move them to a cold wallet, which would be storing your keys in an offline medium, such as a CD-ROM or a USB stick, or even on printed on a piece of paper as a QR code, or even as raw text. And you can store those. And not only can you store those, you can physically transfer those to somebody. I don't have to transact on the Bitcoin. There's things called off-chain transactions, where I can simply walk up to somebody, hand them my private keys, and now they control those assets. So those types of transactions are nearly impossible to track because we just don't know who met in a coffee shop in Prague and handed somebody a USB stick holding the secret sauce that allows them to access all the assets. So it becomes more and more difficult the further removed you get from the ecosystem. But on the ecosystem, there are many ways that we can leverage to trace assets and figure out who the actors are.
Great, thank you, David. Very, very clear. Nina, can I come to you and as we kind of come towards the end of our session now and say, let's move from investigations maybe into protection and how we should protect oneself. What controls can we have in place? What are your thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at individuals and institutions separately, I think the first thing to say is if you want to invest in crypto assets, you need to have a very strong stomach, because you can make some significant gains, and there's lots of stories of people that's made a lot of money on it, and there's also lots of stories of people that have lost everything. So you almost need to go into it being prepared to lose what you're investing. I think the important thing for individuals is to make sure you do really, really thorough due diligence on the platform that you're purchasing through or trading with. There was a well-documented fraud case a couple of years ago involving a new cryptocurrency called OneCoin, which some of you may have heard of, which was hailed as the new big cryptocurrency. And people invested millions in this new currency, and the woman that set it up ran off with the money, and it turned out there was actually no blockchain database associated with it, which is the only thing that really prevents a cryptocurrency from being manipulated. So I think, as an individual, the due diligence, make sure you know the platform that you're going to be dealing with, and make sure you do some good due diligence on that. Turning now to the platforms themselves, I think, as we talked about earlier, the sort of KYC processes that the platforms have had traditionally have been relatively poor. So I think, it's really a case of improving those processes before they let investors onto their platforms. And that will then help them protect themselves against hackers and ensure they don't get caught up sort of breaching other regulations such as anti-money laundering, etc. James, what else should people do in terms of evidence protection preservation?
Yeah, I think software writers are all over this at the moment, and it's been fascinating as a non-techie, as a lawyer, to see this develop. But I mean, we came across in the first two cases I mentioned the use of tumblers as a way of trying to disguise the way that the crypto had been dealt with after it was stolen, and after the hack had occurred. There's some really good software out there now that combats that. So keeping ahead of that. Equally, there are some very good sort of algorithmic due diligence packages out there which allow you to spot people who suddenly appear as a trader wanting to trade huge volumes of very high value, but with no history of doing that. Equally, people who have been on multiple platforms in the past and appear to have moved on or been moved on, more particularly, on a regular basis. There are all sorts of ways that you can protect yourself in that way. And I think the point Nina's made about basic due diligence, both as a platform and as a user of platforms. Don't assume that because something looks glossy and impressive, it is glossy and impressive. And Nebius was a great example of that. So, in a sense, there's no magic to this. It's old school due diligence, but it's performed in the digital world, and that's what makes it interesting and different, and in many ways challenging. And I as I say, I think the biggest danger, David's point is absolutely right. Two people can meet in the street, hand over a digital key to a wallet containing hundreds of millions of dollars, and that is an untraceable transfer. And I have to say, if you take that example, there's not a lot you can do to protect yourself if you're a regulator or a person who's had that stolen from.
So look, we are thank you, Jess. Thank you all. In fact, we're running out of time. We've only got 5 minutes until we have to close, and I'm really determined to be on time. I'm going to just ask for any final comments from any of our panelists today, which is effectively if there was one takeaway you would ask the audience to take away from the session today, what would it be? And I will go in the order we started, I think. So, Mark, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so I think for me, it's that the cryptocurrency landscape it's constantly evolving, and it's so varied that even categorizing the different cryptocurrencies is a challenge before you even get to how you're actually going to regulate them. And what I in particular find fascinating actually is this kind of difference between decentralized and centralized. So we set up cryptocurrencies that are decentralized by nature, and we end up with points of centralization like exchanges coming into those. Then as kind of innovation continues, we end up with decentralized exchanges. And again, as a regulator, how do you then tackle that now? Who do you go after if there isn't a central body anymore? Is it the developers? Where do you go? So I think there's some real challenges here, but I find it already fascinating, and I think there's loads more to come in this space.
Thank you, Mark. James, I think you were next. May I ask you for your final comments?
Yeah, I think my big takeaway is the inconsistency of regulation. And what I would say to everybody is don't wait for the regulators to join this party, because inconsistent regulation is not far off no regulation. And I think you have to appreciate that if you want to get involved with crypto assets, or you have to deal with them in a professional capacity, whatever capacity, you have to work out a lot of that for yourself, because there is no consistent voice in any jurisdiction as to what you can and can't do and why. And that makes it interesting for we lawyers, and I suspect for the techies, but it as a consumer proposition, that can be formidable.
Thank you, James. David, I think you were next, please.
I think my biggest takeaway is we've only just begun. We think that we're gotten very far thus far, but we're really in the infancy days of cryptocurrencies, and really, we haven't even touched on in this discussion the concepts of DeFi, which are a whole nother layer of technologies for transferring funds that are layered on top of cryptocurrencies and allow people to do things like leverage cryptocurrencies, make micro loans to each other on blockchains. There's a whole greater world out there, and I'm very enthusiastic about where we're headed down the road.
Super, David. And may I leave the last word for you, Nina?
Yeah, I think my takeaway is that this is not going away. So who would have thought sort of 10, 15 years ago that no one would be paying by check anymore? I think digitized trading is here to stay, and we all need to embrace it. But the pitfalls are numerous and always tend to be experienced by those on the cutting edge. So, keep well advised and do your due diligence.
Super. Well, look, it just leaves me to say thank you to the panelists for your time today, and thank you for all of the attendees who've joined the session today. All the questions we have, we didn't get around to answering, we'll just send around a quick answer, so you'll get that as follow-up. And the one thing I will say is that someone mentioned Gary Gensler's session, the new head of the SEC, his recorded sessions at the MIT Sloan School of Management. I watched them too. I thought they were excellent. So if you get a chance to find those free little bit of training online, have a look at what Gary Gensler does at that semester of lectures. Let's leave it there. Thank you ever so much. Thank you for joining, and hope to see you next time.